The air in the squad car was thick with the scent of stale coffee and worn vinyl, a familiar, comforting funk to Officer Caleb Vance. It was 3:17 a.m., and the graveyard shift had settled into that deep, surreal quiet that only true darkness can bring to the city of Blackwood. Blackwood wasn't a metropolis, but it had its secrets, nestled deep in the damp forests of the Pacific Northwest, perpetually draped in a low, silver mist. Caleb was a creature of habit, and his habit was patrolling Sector 7, a mostly residential, older part of town where the maple trees clawed over the streets and the houses seemed to huddle together, whispering. His partner, a young officer named Maya Reyes, was quietly reviewing case files on her tablet, the low glow illuminating her tired, thoughtful face. "Anything interesting on the Hickson break-in, Reyes?" Caleb asked, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Maya sighed, looking up. "Just the usual. Broken window, missing laptop. Mr. Hickson is convinced it was his ex-wife's new boyfriend. Says he saw him watching the house. Domestic drama disguised as grand larceny," Caleb muttered. "It was always something simple, something human." Caleb wished for the simple ones, the ones that made sense. The silence that followed was broken not by the radio, but by the squad car's internal MDT, mobile data terminal, which chimed with a priority alert. Caleb glanced at the screen. .911, structure alarm, commercial, 448, Pine Ridge Road. The old asylum. Caleb's blood ran cold. The old asylum, the Blackwood Sanitarium, shuttered for 30 years. It was an unofficial local legend, a looming, derelict Gothic monument set back in the woods, the site of countless ghost stories, urban legends about botched procedures, and the more grounded, chilling tale of the mass disappearance of staff and patients in the 1970s, which the police eventually chalked up to a cult and a mass suicide, despite no bodies ever being found. It had been legally condemned, fenced off, and was considered one of the town's most dangerous nuisances. "No way," Maya whispered, her eyes wide as she read the alert. 448 Pine Ridge. That's the asylum. It has to be a faulty sensor or some idiot kids. "There are no sensors, Reyes," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave. "The place is a shell, and the perimeter fence is 8 feet of razor wire. The only alarm there would be if someone physically tripped the decades-old landline connection they never bothered to cut." He put the car in gear. "Dispatch 7A1. We are responding to 448 Pine Ridge. Check the history on that alarm." The dispatcher's voice, usually crisp, was hesitant. 7A1 confirm. "We are checking. The system shows a direct line break. No environmental triggers on file for that address. Proceed with caution. Backup is 10 minutes out." The drive was short but felt endless, the mist thickening until the headlights could barely cut through the oppressive gray-white shroud. When they reached the fence, there was no sign of trespassers. No car, no flashlights, no beer cans. Just the iron gate, slightly ajar, the chain sawed through. "No car, no kids," Maya said, her hand instinctively going to her holstered sidearm. Caleb killed the engine. The silence was absolute. Not a cricket, not an owl. Just the faint ping of the cooling engine. "Stay low, Reyes. Let's make this quick. We clear the ground floor and wait for backup." They moved silently up the cracked asphalt drive toward the building, a colossal, silent watcher with rows of shattered, empty windows staring like blind eyes. As they neared the main entrance, they both smelled it. Not dust, not decay, but a heavy metallic scent, like old copper and ozone. The oak double doors, which should have been sealed and chained, were pulled open just enough to allow entry. "After you, Officer Reyes," Caleb murmured, pulling his heavy flashlight. Inside, the lobby was a cavern of shadow and neglect. Dust motes danced in the beams of their lights. The metallic smell was stronger here. They passed the old reception desk, the walls, scarred with peeling paint and grime. "Nothing," Maya said, her voice strained. "Just rot. Maybe someone came in, hit a wire, and bailed." "Maybe," Caleb said, but his gut screamed otherwise. He moved toward the main corridor, his boots crunching on plaster and broken glass. Then, they heard it. Not a scream, not a gunshot, but something worse, a low, rhythmic thump, 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 emanating from the administrative wing on the second floor. It was the sound of something heavy being dropped, or something slow and deliberate moving with difficulty. "Upstairs," Caleb whispered, his heart hammering a violent, syncopated rhythm against his ribs. They found the main staircase. As they ascended, the metallic stench became so potent it was almost sickening. On the second-floor landing, the sound was louder, clearer. Thump, thump, thump. They moved toward the source, flashlights sweeping over open doors of abandoned offices. The last room in the hall, the former director's office, was sealed by a solid mahogany door. The thumping was coming from behind it. Caleb pushed the door open with the toe of his boot, his weapon raised. The room was vast, dominated by a huge mahogany desk covered in 3 decades of dust. But the thumping stopped abruptly. The room was empty. "Clear," Caleb announced, scanning the room. "Where did the sound go?" Maya asked, her voice a thin thread. Her light swept over the desk, then the walls. That's when Caleb saw it. On the wall behind the desk, in the center of a perfectly preserved section of pale blue wallpaper, was a single, fresh mark. Not dirt, not dust. It was a perfect, dark, sticky handprint, and it was upside down, as if someone or something had been crawling along the ceiling before dropping into the room, and then silently vanished. That Maya's breath hitched. She lowered her flashlight, and her eyes focused on a spot of the ceiling directly above the desk, then down to a small, dark object on the dusty floor. "Caleb," she choked out. "Look, on the floor." It was a small, crudely carved wooden toy, a tiny, headless figure of a police officer. It looked brand new, as if it had been placed there only moments before, and it lay right next to a damp, dark crimson smear that could have only been fresh blood. Caleb's training kicked in, overriding the primal terror, tightening his chest. He lowered his sidearm slightly, but kept it ready, flashlight beam fixed on the gruesome tableau on the floor. "Don't touch anything, Reyes," he ordered, his voice low and strained. He knelt, keeping his distance from a small, macabre scene. The wooden figurine was unsettlingly smooth, the carving intricate, despite the missing head. It was clearly fashioned by hand. "That blood, it's fresh, Caleb," Maya whispered, her eyes darting nervously to the upside-down handprint on the wall, and then to the ceiling, too dark and thick to be old paint or rust. "Exactly. Someone was here. Someone left a message," Caleb said, his jaw clenched. He was acutely aware of the vast, dead silence of the building surrounding them now. The metallic smell was overpowering, almost choking. He straightened up, sweeping his light beam over the entire room again, slowly, methodically. There were no other exits, only the single doorway and 2 large, shattered windows overlooking the dark, misty woods. No shadows moved outside. The thumping wasn't footsteps, Reyes, Caleb realized, his voice a low rasp. It was a decoy. They were already here, in this room, when we started up the stairs, and they were quiet. He pointed to the ceiling with his flashlight. The dust lay undisturbed across the ancient plaster, except for a line leading from the center of the room to a small, nearly hidden maintenance panel in the corner. The line was a faint, almost invisible track, a disturbance in the dust the width of a human hand. "They didn't vanish. They went up," Caleb concluded. "They didn't want us to find this room. Not yet. They wanted us to hear the sound, then find the empty room. It's a game." He moved quickly to the small panel. It was a metal square, perhaps 2 feet across, used for accessing plumbing or electrical conduits. It was bolted shut, but one of the bolts was missing, and the panel was slightly ajar. "Dispatch 7A1. Caleb spoke into his shoulder mic, his voice betraying none of the chaos in the room. "We have signs of forced entry and an active scene. We need an immediate perimeter lockdown and search team. Advise the chief. We have fresh blood and possible evidence of a concealed passage inside the building." 7A1 acknowledged. "Chief is en route. ETA 10 minutes for the first unit. Stand by." Maya had moved to the desk, her light sweeping over the dust. "Wait a minute, Caleb. Look here." She pointed to the desktop. Scratched deep into the 30-year-old layer of grime, almost hidden, were 2 distinct symbols. One was an inverted triangle, The other was a circle bisected by a jagged, vertical line. More messages, Caleb murmured. Cult symbols? Kids trying to be edgy. Kids don't leave fresh blood and crawl into walls, Maya countered, shaking her head. This place, it's just wrong. Caleb pulled his multi-tool from his belt, inserted the flathead into the remaining bolt on the maintenance panel, and began to twist. The bolt groaned, then popped free. He lifted the heavy panel. A gust of cold, foul-smelling air rushed out, a mix of damp earth, stagnant water, and that pervasive, metallic tang. Below, an unexpected, narrow shaft led down into absolute darkness. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a vertical drop of several feet, opening into what looked like a subterranean tunnel. The air down there seemed to devour the light. The sanitarium had these tunnels, Maya recalled, her voice barely a whisper. Local history says they were originally steam tunnels for the heating system, but they sealed most of them off years ago. Said they were unstable. The maintenance blueprints never showed an access point in the director's office, Caleb said, shining his light into the abyss. He adjusted his pistol grip. This wasn't on the plans. This was built after they stopped caring about blueprints, after the disappearances. He looked back at the headless toy, the fresh blood, the symbols. They're in there, Reyes, the ones who triggered the alarm, and they want us to. Follow. Caleb, backup is 5 minutes away. We should wait, Maya pleaded, her face pale in the reflected light, but he looked at the dark tunnel, then at the upside-down handprint, an image of defiance and cold malice. If we wait, they cover their tracks. If we wait, they disappear back into the ground like whatever they are. They let us here. We finished the first act. Caleb carefully secured the panel next to the opening. You cover the door, Reyes. Stay on the radio. If I don't respond in 3 minutes, you call for an emergency extraction at this exact location and come down after me. Clear. Maya swallowed hard, nodding once. Clear, Caleb. Be careful. Caleb clipped his flashlight to his vest, pulled his spare to throw down into the darkness, and then, without hesitation, he swung his legs into the suffocating darkness of the old asylum's hidden tunnels. He dropped a few feet onto a narrow, damp concrete floor. The cold immediately leached through his boots. He was in a space barely wide enough for his shoulders, the ceiling low and menacing. His light illuminated the walls, not concrete, but rough, hand-dug earth, braced in spots by ancient, rotting wood. This was not a steam tunnel. This was a private excavation. He shone his light down the tunnel. It ran straight for about 30 feet before making a sharp turn into deeper blackness. The metallic smell here was overwhelming, mingled now with something else, a faint, sour odor, like spoiled meat and cheap perfume. Then he heard it again. Not the thump, thump, thump of a decoy. This was different. From the blackness around the corner, Caleb heard a sound that was impossible, a sound that made his stomach knot and his palms sweat. A single, faint giggle, the high, clear, chilling sound of a small child laughing in the deepest pit of the earth. And it was coming closer. Caleb froze, pressed against the rough, cold earthen wall of the tunnel. The giggle, it was high-pitched, playful, and utterly incongruous with the suffocating darkness and the stench of rot. It cut through the silence like a razor. He tightened his grip on his pistol, moving his light beam to pierce the corner. There was nothing, just the sharp turn and the endless black. Caleb, report. Maya's voice crackled, faint and anxious. From the radio clipped to his shoulder, he forced his voice to remain steady. I'm 30 feet down. It's not a steam tunnel, Reyes. It's hand-dug. Narrow. I hear something. What? What do you hear? A child. Caleb lied, not wanting to panic his partner with a word giggle. He knew the rules. Never admit the impossible over the air. Maybe a runaway or a trespasser. Stay put. Do not follow yet. He clicked the radio off mid-sentence, needing to focus. The giggle hadn't repeated, but the metallic, coppery odor, the smell of blood, was now so intense it made his eyes water. It smelled less like a smear of blood and more like a butcher's shop. He took 3 careful steps forward, the narrow space forcing him to move sideways. He reached the corner and slowly angled his light. The tunnel didn't continue straight. It opened into a larger, circular chamber, maybe 12 feet wide. In the center of the chamber, his light caught a shape that was a porcelain doll, meticulously dressed in a tattered, antique nurse's uniform. It was propped up on a small, dark wooden box, facing him. The doll's face was chipped and cracked, but its fixed, glass eyes seemed to reflect his light with cold, mocking amusement that Caleb's throat was dry. A doll. This was staged, a deliberate effort to disorient and terrorize, but then he saw the box it was sitting on. It wasn't just wood. It was an old-fashioned first aid kit, rusted and dented. He moved closer, his boots kicking up fine, dry soil that settled instantly. But he reached the box and peered down. The lid was open. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed gauze, was a small, polished silver whistle, and draped over the whistle, a single, long strand of dark, human hair. Suddenly, a shift in the air behind him made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A swift, silent movement. He didn't turn. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that whatever had been crawling on the ceiling above was now directly behind him, breathing the same cold air. He spun around, pistol leveled, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the space he had just traversed. The tunnel was empty, but where he had been standing only seconds before, now lay another object. It must have been dropped from the ceiling in the brief moment he was distracted by the doll. That was a small, folded piece of paper. Caleb snatched it up, turning back into the relative safety of the chamber. The paper was brittle and yellowed, like a page torn from an old diary. Scrawled across it in a messy, looping cursive was a single, simple sentence. It was never about the patients, Officer Vance. It was about what they found. The handwriting was feminine, yet shaky, almost manic, and the paper was still cold. Caleb knew he should retreat, wait for backup, hand this terrifying piece of evidence over to the detectives. But the sheer audacity of the perpetrator, or things, to place the message directly behind him, to use the blackness and the scent of blood as a weapon, ignited a furious need for answers. They knew his name. He looked back at the doll. On the concrete floor, leading from the doll's wooden box into the deeper, unlit section of the chamber, was a trail. Not footsteps, but small, deliberate drag marks. The drag marks were too consistent, too perfect to be random debris. They were exactly the width of the police figurine's headless body. Caleb raised his flashlight and followed the trail, his heart now a cold, desperate drumbeat. He moved deeper into the circular chamber. The drag marks led to a far wall, which was mostly obscured by thick, mold-covered plastic sheeting, like the kind used to seal off a construction zone. The stench here was at its peak. Copper, rot, and a sickeningly sweet perfume. He reached the sheeting and touched it. It was cold, slick, and strangely taut. He could hear a muffled, wet scraping sound from behind it. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the plastic and ripped it down. The chamber extended into a wide, shallow pit carved into the earth. And it wasn't empty. In the center of the pit, illuminated by his frantic light, was a mountain of old, discarded uniforms, police uniforms, hospital gowns, security guard shirts, all piled high. Decades of Blackwoods missing laid bare, and on top of the pile a figure. Not the child he heard, but a man tall, gaunt, dressed in a pristine white patient's gown, his back to Caleb. He was meticulously working, his thin, pale hands moving carefully. The man was carving something into a piece of wood with a razor blade. He paused, lifting the object to examine his work in the gloom. Was the head of the police figurine. The man turned his head just enough to catch the light, revealing a face of sunken eyes and stretched, unnaturally pale skin. His lips parted in a smile that was all teeth and no humor, and he whispered something that echoed against the damp earth. "Found him," he hissed. He then lifted the unfinished wooden head, and with a swift, sickening movement, he began to rub it vigorously against his own raw, exposed neck, soaking the fresh carving in a spray of his own dark blood. The sight of the man, the patient, violently smearing his own blood onto the tiny wooden head, snapped Caleb out of his terror. This wasn't a ghost story. It was a crime scene, albeit the most deranged one he had ever encountered. "Police, drop the knife and put your hands above your head," Caleb roared, his voice echoing brutally in the pit. He took 2 steps back toward the tunnel entrance, his pistol aimed dead center at the man's chest. The patient didn't flinch. He slowly lowered the razor blade and the newly bloodied wooden head, his vacant eyes fixed on Caleb. His smile remained, unnervingly wide and utterly devoid of intelligence, like a mask stretched too tightly. "The headless officer," the patient whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound, like sandpaper. He held the 2 pieces, the headless body and the newly stained head, up for Caleb to see, as if presenting a trophy. He needs his eyes to see the pattern, the real pattern. Before Caleb could issue another command, the patient moved with a speed that belied his gaunt frame. He didn't charge Caleb. Instead, he dropped the wooden pieces, and in a single, fluid motion, he lunged into the pile of uniforms, disappearing instantly into the mound of fabric and grime. "Hold your position. Do not move," Caleb yelled, his light frantically searching the pile. The air was silent again, save for the rapid hiss of his own breath. He knew he couldn't fire into the mound. The suspect could be anywhere inside it, and Caleb needed him alive for questioning. He crept forward, keeping his gun trained on the shifting fabric that a low, guttural moan emanated from the center of the pile. "Show yourself," Caleb demanded. The patient didn't rise. Instead, the pile of uniforms began to sink inward, as if the ground beneath it was collapsing. The fabric swirled, revealing a dark, circular opening where the mound had been. The patient was descending, not into the ground, but into another layer of the tunnels. Caleb dashed to the edge of the pit. He saw the patient's pale face flash once more in the dying light, looking up at him with that sickening, joyful grin, before vanishing completely. He shone his light down the hole. It was a perfectly round, roughly cut shaft, descending at a steep angle into a profound depth. "Caleb, what was that noise? Backup is arriving. I see headlights outside." Maya's frantic voice came over the mic. "Reyes, I have a suspect. Male, wearing a patient's gown, armed with a razor, bloodied. He just descended into a newly discovered vertical shaft off the main chamber. I need you to secure the entrance and wait for the tactical team. Advise them this facility is honeycombed with tunnels, and we have an active, dangerous subject." "A patient. Where did he come from? Are you going after him?" "I have to, Reyes. He's talking about patterns, and he knows my name. He's connected to whoever is running this operation. I'm going in." Caleb knew it was reckless, but he couldn't let the crucial piece of the puzzle slip away into the dark. He secured his pistol and holster, pulled a coil of emergency rope from his kit, and fastened it around a support beam near the plastic sheeting. As he was preparing to descend, he swept his flashlight across the pit one last time. He saw the headless officer figurine, lying where the patient dropped it, next to the bloody wooden head, but beside the toys, resting on a clean, exposed section of concrete, was another object. It was a standard-issue Blackwood Police Department pocket notebook. Caleb snatched it up. The cover was clean, and the edges were sharp. It was new. He flipped it open to the first page. The top of the page had a name written neatly: Detective David Kincaid. Detective Kincaid was a Blackwood PD legend, the lead investigator on the original 1970s asylum disappearance case. He was the one who signed off on a mass suicide verdict. Kincaid died in a supposed accidental house fire 2 years after closing the case, and below his name, written in the same looping, feminine hand as the note, was a short list of names, each one crossed out: Hickson, Harris, Lowell, and at the very bottom, underlined 3 times, Vance. Caleb felt a cold wave of certainty crash over him. This wasn't a game of trespassers. This was a targeted operation, decades in the making, and it had been following a checklist. And he was next. He didn't hesitate this time. He clipped his light to his vest, grabbed the rope, and slid down the narrow, dirt-lined shaft, plunging into the blackness after the man in the white gown. The shaft opened out onto a wide, concrete floor. This new tunnel was older, sturdier, clearly part of the original building infrastructure, unlike the narrow earthen ones above. The air here was colder, denser, and carried the definite stench of chemicals, formalin and ammonia, the smell of an old medical lab. His light swept over the walls. They were lined with rusted steel doors, the type used for secure storage or containment. Suddenly, a door halfway down the tunnel slammed shut, the metal shrieking in protest. The patient was ahead of him. Caleb sprinted forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in his knees. When he reached the slamming door, he grabbed the handle. It was locked. He pulled his foot back to kick the lock when he heard a noise from the other side of the thick steel, a rapid, insistent clicking sound. He leaned close to the door, listening. The clicking wasn't random. It was a code. Click, 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 click. It repeated 3 times. And then, from deep within the sterile, chemical-smelling darkness behind the door, a low, smooth voice, completely unlike the patient's rasp, spoke a single, chilling phrase in perfect, unaccented English. "The pattern is complete, officer. You've brought the last key to the lock." Caleb immediately stepped back from the door, raising his weapon and aiming at the lock mechanism. The smooth, resonant voice had unnerved him far more than the frantic patient. It was cold, intelligent, and disturbingly calm. "Identify yourself. Open the door," Caleb commanded, his voice tight. The clicking sound behind the door began again, slower this time, as if the speaker was deliberately tapping a rhythm on something hard. Click, 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 click. Then the voice returned, sounding amused. "Identity is fluid down here, Officer Vance. We are merely the continuation of a failed thesis, and you have certainly expedited the final examination." The air in the tunnel felt suddenly heavy, pressing against Caleb. He looked down at the notebook in his hand, Kincaid's notebook, the list of crossed-out names, and his own underlined at the bottom. The clicking code, the patient, the symbols. It was all connected to the original 1970s case. He needed to get through that door, but he wouldn't risk being pulled into a trap. He took a chance, pulling out his multi-tool, inserting the pick into the keyhole, and starting to work the tumbler, all while keeping his peripheral vision glued to the tunnel behind him. "Caleb, the tactical team is here. They're sitting up on the 2nd floor. Report your status. We're coming down." Maya's voice burst through the radio, louder this time. "Negative, Reyes. Hold your position. I have 2 subjects. One just fled. The second is communicating from behind a locked steel door. This area is a sub-level laboratory, highly volatile. Do not breach the 2nd floor yet. I need an extraction team at this door, now. Send a single man with a thermal camera, code red." He heard Maya acknowledge the order, the panic audible even through the static. Just as the lock began to click open, a small victory. The smooth voice from behind the door spoke again, sounding closer now, as if the speaker's face were pressed against the cold steel. Detective Kincaid thought he was safe when he closed the file, officer. He thought the fire would erase the evidence, but the evidence was not on the paper. It was in the patterns. Caleb froze, his fingers pulling the final tumbler open. He snatched the pick out, then kicked the door open violently, springing back and leveling his pistol. The room was a massive, dark laboratory, filled with rows of sterile stainless steel tables, covered in decades of dust and medical residue. The walls were lined with old filtration equipment and empty chemical containers, and it was empty. Again, Caleb's flashlight beam swept the room, seeking movement, reflection, anything that he noticed immediately that this room was far cleaner than the rest of the asylum. The dust layer was thin, disturbed in patches, and the air was notably less foul. Someone had been actively using this space, that he moved cautiously, checking behind the large containment hoods. Nothing. Then he noticed the far wall. Unlike the other steel, sterile walls, this section was covered in a sprawling, intricate mural of crude, horrifying drawings. It looked like the work of a disturbed mind, painted in various shades of brown and crimson. As Caleb approached the mural, the metallic, coppery smell returned, stronger than ever. The paint wasn't paint. It was dried blood. The mural depicted abstract shapes, human figures with missing limbs, and the recurring symbols, the inverted triangle and the jagged line circle. But in the center, dominating the wall, was a hyper-detailed drawing of the old asylum itself, and at the base of the drawn asylum, a small section was labeled in that same looping script. The incubator. Caleb traced the word with his glove. He pulled back, his light beam moving to the floor beneath the mural. Embedded in the concrete floor was a large, circular brass drain cover, 3 feet across, bolted down with heavy-duty fasteners. Unlike the other rusty fixtures in the room, the brass was polished to a terrifying gleam, reflecting his light like a malicious as he watched. One of the heavy bolts, holding the cover in place, slowly began to rotate, unscrewing itself with a low, agonizing creak. The movement was clearly mechanical, deliberate. Caleb instinctively dropped to one knee, aiming at the drain cover. "Stop the movement. Identify yourself." The bolt finished unscrewing and fell silently to the concrete. The polished brass cover began to lift slowly, revealing an inky, black void beneath. From the darkness, the smooth, cold voice finally came, sounding as if it were speaking up from a great depth, wet and echoing. "The pattern is never complete, officer. We just move the pieces." A massive blast of hot, fetid air rushed out of the drain, carrying a new, unbearable stench. Not just blood and chemicals, but something organic, heavy, and decomposing. And then, a sound that made Caleb's blood freeze in his veins, the low, vibrating rattle of what sounded like heavy, segmented legs scrambling rapidly up a slick, brass surface. Something vast and utterly inhuman was ascending from the depths of the incubator beneath the lab. Caleb knew then that he was no longer hunting a man, or a cult, or even a killer. He was about to confront the reason the asylum had been closed 30 years ago. The reason Detective Kincaid had to die in a fire. He fired 2 rounds into the center of the rising brass cover, shattering the stillness of the underground, preparing to face whatever hideous life was emerging from the drain. Caleb fired 2 rounds. The 9mm slug struck the gleaming brass drain cover with a deafening, metallic clank in the confined space, ricocheting the cover back down onto the cement. The rattling and scrambling sound ceased immediately. The sudden, unnatural silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. "Reyes, status update. Breach on the north side, sublevel 2 now." Caleb screamed into his mic, never taking his eyes off the drain. "We're coming. 3 officers are on the stairs." "What was that noise, Caleb? Did you fire? Report target status." Maya's voice was frantic, close. "Target status unknown. There's a deep shaft access point hidden under a false wall in the main lab. I heard something heavy and segmented ascending the drain. I fired to secure the breach," Caleb reported, forcing himself to use professional terms. He reloaded his weapon instinctively, his hand shaking slightly. He was momentarily distracted by a flicker of movement to his left. He spun the flashlight beam. The man in the patient's gown, the patient, was back. He was standing in the shadows, pressed against a row of steel tables, silent as before. He was no longer holding the razor or the wooden head. Instead, his pale, bloody hands were clasped together, and he was rocking gently. "It can't wait for the pattern," the patient whispered, a tear tracking a clean path through the blood and grime on his cheek. "It's hungry now. You woke it up." Before Caleb could move or speak, the patient turned his head sharply toward the wall of crude, crimson drawings. He began to scratch frantically at the dried blood mural with his fingernails, his breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. "The patterns," he choked out. "The wrong patterns. We tried to stop it, Kincaid and me, but he sold his eyes for a quiet street." Caleb took 2 quick steps toward the patient, trying to isolate him from the mural. "Stop talking. Who is we? What did Kincaid sell?" Suddenly, the patient's scratching uncovered a section of the wall. Not more blood, but a small, recessed metal box, a safe of some kind, hidden beneath the gruesome painting. The patient punched the metal box with a desperate cry of effort, and it sprang open. Inside, illuminated by Caleb's light, were stacks of perfectly preserved, meticulously labeled index cards. "The patient records," the smooth voice echoed, chillingly clear, from the still-sealed drain. "Kincaid didn't burn them, Officer Vance. He just changed the key." The patient grabbed a handful of the cards, his eyes wild, and threw them at Caleb. "The key. The real pattern." Caleb dodged the flurry of cards, trying to keep his aim steady. The moment he flinched, the patient launched himself not at Caleb, but head first back into the open safe. He began to bite and tear at the remaining index cards with the savage desperation of a trapped animal. Caleb knew he couldn't fire. He needed the records. He lunged forward, tackling the patient around the waist, pulling him back from the safe. The patient screamed, a high, unearthly sound of pain and frustration. He clawed at Caleb's vest, his strength unnatural. As Caleb wrestled him to the ground, his flashlight beam fell on the man's neck. That it wasn't a standard patient's gown. The man's neck was encircled by a thick, heavy steel collar, bolted shut. Engraved on the collar was a single number, P001. The first patient, the one they never found. The patient suddenly went limp, his eyes rolling up, but his mouth opened one last time. The incubator holds children. He gasped before his eyes locked onto something behind Caleb, and his face contorted in true, horrifying fear. Behind you, he whispered, a final, despairing sound. Caleb didn't wait. He shoved the limp body aside and rolled, his gun swinging around to cover the newly discovered shaft. Instead of the shaft, his light caught a shape emerging from the shadows near the entrance of the lab. It was a person, dressed in a black tactical uniform, moving silently. Police, don't move, Caleb yelled, aiming. The figure stopped, raising their hands slowly. It was a woman, her face obscured by the high collar of the uniform and the deep shadows of the hood. Relax, officer, the figure said, her voice the same smooth, calm, intelligent tone he had heard from behind the steel door and the drain. The voice, I'm an extraction specialist. Call sign, Shepard. You called for backup, I came. My team is securing the tunnels. We need to stabilize the situation. This facility is a biohazard. You are contaminated. She took one step closer, and her hands, still raised, parted slightly to reveal a small, polished silver whistle identical to the one found in the old first aid box. And you have something that belongs to the pattern, Officer Vance, the detective's ledger. Caleb glanced down at his hand, Kincaid's notebook. He looked back at the woman. She was too calm, too clean, and too informed. You're not Blackwood PD, Caleb said, his voice flat. Who are you? She smiled, a cold, surgical expression. I am the one who ensures the pattern is never broken. In a terrifying blur, she dropped her raised hands. In one hand, she had produced a syringe the size of Caleb's forearm. In the other, a high-frequency acoustic weapon, a small, black device aimed directly at the drain cover. She pressed a button on the device. An ear-splitting, high-pitched screech of white noise erupted, aimed solely at the brass drain. The brass cover immediately began to jump and rattle violently, clearly agitating whatever was sealed beneath it. Drop the weapon, officer, or I break the seal entirely, she threatened, taking another step closer, the syringe poised. Let's see what happens to Blackwood when the children come home. Caleb knew he was outmatched. The Shepherd was operating on an entirely different level, with specialized equipment and a chilling, clinical focus. He lowered his pistol slightly, holding his breath against the paralyzing screech aimed at the drain. The sheer violence of the sound indicated it wasn't just noise. It was an attack, a way to control or manipulate whatever lurked below. What are you doing? What are the children? Caleb demanded, his voice strained against the acoustic assault. Shepard maintained her terrifying composure, holding the syringe like a conductor's baton. The children are the evidence, Officer Vance. The patterns yield, and I am simply protecting the experiment from premature exposure. You and your detective friend disrupted the quarantine protocol. She took another step, closing the distance to just 10 feet. Now the ledger. Drop it, and you walk out with your partner. Refuse, and the incubator gets a full course meal. Caleb calculated his odds. He was exposed alone, and the brass drain cover was vibrating so violently it was starting to warp. He had to assume the patient's warning was real. Something monstrous was about to emerge. He didn't drop the ledger. Instead, he lunged to his right, aiming for the pile of index cards the patient had scattered earlier. He scooped up a handful of the yellowed cards and threw them hard toward Shepard's face, simultaneously firing a warning shot into the ceiling above her head. The blast was deafening. Shepard flinched, the acoustic weapon momentarily wavering off the drain in that fraction of a second. The screech died, and the brass cover stopped vibrating. The air in the lab immediately changed. The hot, fetid stench was replaced by a massive, rushing wave of cold, clean, moving air, like an underground gale. And from the drain, the smooth voice returned, no longer echoing, but immediate and vast. "Stop her, Vance. She lies." Shepard let out a sharp, genuine cry of panic. She abandoned her attempt to inject Caleb and dove behind a massive, rusted filtration unit. The syringe and the acoustic device clattered uselessly on the concrete. "The seal is compromised." Shepard shrieked, her clinical demeanor shattered. "They're moving through the vents. Evacuate. This is an immediate, system-wide bio-breach." Caleb heard it then, too. Not the rattling of segmented legs, but a sound like hundreds of sharp fingernails scraping and clicking against metal ductwork, radiating outward from a lab, through the ceiling and walls. Whatever was sealed beneath the drain was now spreading throughout the asylum. He checked the patient. P-001 was still slumped on the ground, unconscious, or perhaps dead. He looked at the sealed drain, then at the index cards he still held. The cards weren't patient records. They were photographs, taken with old, high-flash photography. They showed various doctors and staff members, including a younger, more nervous-looking Detective Kincaid, standing around a table, examining something. And that something was the source of all the horror. The photographs showed 3 identical, large, amber-colored eggs, resting on a silver tray. The eggs were organic, covered in intricate, crystalline patterns, and seemed to pulsate with a faint, inner light. On the back of the topmost card, scrawled in Kincaid's neat hand, was a simple, terrifying note. "The core. 3 found. 1974. Caleb realized the terrible truth. The patients weren't the only ones in the asylum. The sanitarium was a cover. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the doorway. "Police. Freeze. Drop your weapon." 3 officers, including Maya, burst into the lab, the tactical gear making them look massive and prepared. But they looked utterly unprepared for the silent lab, the strange woman hiding behind a machine, and the man in the patient's gown. "Maya, stay back. This area is an active biological threat." Caleb yelled, but it was too late. As the officers advanced, Shepard sprang out from behind the filtration unit, not toward Caleb, but toward the central drain. She grabbed a heavy, rusty wrench and began hammering the warped brass cover, frantically trying to reseal the drain. "Do not let her touch the seal." Caleb shouted, realizing her true intent. Maya, seeing the strange woman attacking the floor, raised her weapon. "Stop. Put the wrench down." Before Maya could fire, the scraping and clicking in the walls intensified to a screaming pitch. And then, a section of the ceiling ductwork directly above the drain cover exploded downward. A shower of rusty shrapnel and dust rained down. And in the center of the debris, hanging upside down from a single, thick cable of slick, black matter, was one of the children. It wasn't human. It was roughly the size of a small dog, with skin the color and texture of raw, pale fungus. It had 6 spidery, segmented limbs ending in razor-sharp claws, and a single large, distended head dominated by a horrifyingly recognizable feature. A perfectly formed, childlike human mouth, wide open, emitting the same high-pitched, playful giggle Caleb had heard in the tunnel. It swung down, directly toward Shepard, who screamed a sound of pure, unadulterated fear. "Contact! Fire!" Maya screamed, opening fire on the abomination, the sound of her automatic weapon tearing through the silence. The child shrieked as the bullets impacted, releasing the black cable and dropping onto Shepard, instantly engulfing her in a frenzy of claws and biting. Caleb knew they had to seal the drain. He rushed past the melee, ignoring the screams, grabbing the wrench Shepard had dropped, and began hammering the warping brass cover back into place, with all his strength, fighting to stop the rest of the children from emerging. The laboratory descended into chaos. Maya and the other 2 tactical officers immediately engaged the creature, the child, that was tearing into Shepard. The creature's pale, fungal body was surprisingly resilient. shrugging off several rounds before one shot from Maya's rifle finally struck its oversized, giggling head, causing it to detonate in a viscous spray of dark, oil-like fluid. Shepard lay motionless, half submerged in the thick, chemical-smelling ooze. She was clearly no longer a threat, or even alive. "Seal it. Seal the breach," Maya yelled, her eyes wide with shock and horror, pointing toward the drain. Caleb, hammering the wrench against the warped brass, managed to pound one of the heavy bolts back into its socket. The drain cover immediately stabilized, the rushing wind and cold air ceasing. "It's sealed," Caleb gasped, standing up, panting heavily. The silence was immediate and terrifying. The scraping and clicking in the vent stopped, and the lab was only filled with the echo of gunshots and the stench of gunpowder and the creature's strange, oily residue. "Report," Caleb snapped, turning to his officers. 2 officers secured the perimeter. "They're fine, but they saw that," Maya said, her voice shaking as she gestured toward the remains of the creature and Shepard. "We need to evacuate, Caleb. Now. This is beyond our jurisdiction." Caleb agreed, but he couldn't leave the evidence. He rushed to the wall safe where P001 had been tearing at the records. He found a small duffel bag abandoned near the entrance and swept the remaining index cards and Kincaid's ledger inside. He glanced at the patient, P001. He was dead, his throat clearly sliced by the razor he had held earlier, a final act of desperation and defiance. "Grab the cameras, Reyes. We are documenting the entrance and exiting this hellhole," Caleb ordered as they were moving back toward the tunnel entrance. Caleb felt a chilling drip on the back of his neck. He wiped it away, and his gloved fingers came away slick with the black, oily fluid of the creature. He slowly looked up. The hole in the ceiling where the first child emerged was too high to see clearly, but he could hear a faint, wet slooping sound, as if something large was retracting back into the ventilation shaft. They hadn't defeated the threat. They had only startled IT. They scrambled back through the access panel and up to the second floor. The rest of the tactical unit, led by Sergeant Miller, was waiting, guns drawn, their faces pale under the tactical lighting. They had heard the gunfire and the screams. "Vance, Reyes, what in God's name happened down there? We heard the fire, the screaming," Miller stammered, staring at the blood and oil covering Caleb's uniform. "Sarge, we have an active, non-human biological threat in the sublevels," Caleb interrupted, his tone harsh and authoritative. "The threat is linked to the 1970s disappearances. We found patient records, a deceased specialized agent, and evidence of a decades-long quarantine failure." Caleb pointed to the tunnels. "We sealed the access. We need to lock this entire facility down, double the perimeter, and call in the feds. Not the regular FBI. The Division of Internal Anomalies. Give them Kincaid's name. Tell them we found what he hid." He looked at Maya, who was staring fixedly at the tunnel entrance, breathing heavily. "Maya, you saw it. What exactly was it?" Miller demanded, desperate for a normal police description. Maya took a deep, shuddering breath and stared at her sergeant, her eyes reflecting the horrors of the lab. "It wasn't a man, Sarge. It was a thing. It was pale and wrong, like something born in the dark. And it giggled." Caleb pulled Maya away before she could say more. They made it back to the squad car in a surreal, dreamlike silence, the asylum looming behind them, now doubly sealed by their own tape and the horror they had just unleashed. Back at the station, the atmosphere was a mix of disbelief, fear, and furious activity. Caleb secured the evidence bag in the chief's safe, refusing to let anyone touch the index cards or the ledger until the specialized federal agents arrived. Later that morning, as the sun finally broke through the perpetual blackwood mist, Caleb sat alone in an interrogation room, trying to piece together the fragments of the night. He opened the ledger, looking at the crossed-out names: Hickson, Harris, Lowell. Vance. He flipped through Kincaid's notes. They were sparse, almost telegraphic, documenting the original case. Then he found a detailed entry, dated 3 days before Kincaid's supposed accidental fire. "They are not patients. They are hosts. The children grow from the core, the amber eggs found in the sublevel. They feed on fear and adrenaline. They use the tunnels as a vascular system, and they are protected by the collective, the former staff who didn't escape. They follow a cycle. Every few years, when the containment starts to fail, the collective lures outsiders down. It's not a murder spree. It's a feeding cycle to keep the core stable. The names on the list are the ones they needed to remove from the pattern. I have to burn everything. I have to destroy the ledger. The names are the key. I must erase all trace of the guardian. Caleb stared at the word guardian. He flipped to the very last page of the ledger, which was a rough sketch, a drawing of the circular brass drain cover in the lab, with inverted triangle and jagged circle symbols drawn over it, but the word guardian wasn't written beneath the drain. It was written beneath the symbol of the whistle, the small, silver whistle they had found. Caleb suddenly remembered the Shepherd agent. The calm woman had produced the identical whistle. He realized Shepherd wasn't trying to contain the children. She was trying to protect the core, the eggs, and the feeding cycle. She was the collective's latest operative, the one who enforced the pattern. And the whistle, it wasn't a warning signal. It was a control mechanism. He pulled the police notebook and the index cards from the evidence bag. He looked at the last uncrossed name on Kincaid's hit list. Vance. Why had the patient P001 sacrificed himself to give Caleb the ledger? Why had the smooth voice from the drain, presumably the collective, told him that Shepherd lies? Caleb held up the index card with the pictures of the amber eggs. He flipped it over, examining the blank back. The paper felt thick. He held it up to the fluorescent light, and there, faintly visible beneath the heavy photo paper, was one final, terrifying clue, scrawled in an even older, trembling hand. The core is one. The children are many, but the pattern needs the first. Find the key. He needed to find out who or what the key was, and why his name was on the pattern's final list. He knew the fight wasn't over. It had just moved from the tunnels to the light. Caleb pushed the index card back across the table, his blood running cold despite the heating in the interrogation room. The faint, trembling script was decades older than Kincaid's firm hand, suggesting the note predated the disappearance itself. The core is one. The children are many, but the pattern needs the first. Find the key. He needed a breakthrough, a perspective outside the walls of the Blackwood PD. He called Meyer into the room. "Reyes, look at this list," he said, tapping Kincaid's ledger. Hickson, Harris, Lowell, they were all on Kincaid's list. Hickson was a break-in victim last night. We dismissed it as domestic. Harris and Lowell. Maya, still visibly shaken but focused, immediately pulled the MDT data. Harris was a missing person report filed 3 weeks ago, a plumber who went into the old municipal sewer lines near Sector 7. Lowell was a vagrant found dead near the Pine Ridge forest line last winter. Cause of death was listed as exposure. No, Caleb stated, his gaze hard. Cause of death was listed as convenient. These were sacrifices. They were the food for the children, timed to the pattern's needs. He held up the index card with the faint writing. Shepherd, the woman in the lab, called the list the key to the lock. The patients called it the real pattern. I think the key isn't a person, but an object or a specific piece of information that breaks the cycle. But why your name, Caleb? Maya asked, fear creeping into her voice. Why are you the last one on the list? You're a cop. You weren't involved in the original case. Caleb flipped back to the rough drawing on the last page. The drain, the symbols, and the word guardian pointing to the whistle. He then flipped to Kincaid's final, desperate entry. I must erase all trace of the guardian. Kincaid knew the identity of the guardian, the person who held the whistle and controlled the collective. He tried to hide it by creating the mass suicide file and burning his house. Caleb deduced, tracing the pencil marks. But what if Kincaid didn't succeed in erasing all traces of the guardian? What if the guardian's trace is you? Maya stared at him, bewildered. That makes no sense. The pattern is complex, Reyes. It's an inheritance, Caleb insisted, pulling out a small, laminated family photo from his wallet. A picture of his parents, smiling in front of a Blackwood house. I was an orphan. My father, William Vance, was a Blackwood PD patrolman who died in the line of duty when I was 3. Maya pulled up the Blackwood PD Historical Archive on her MDT. William Vance, Patrolman Vance. Date of death, 1974. Listed cause, vehicle accident on Pine Ridge Road during high-speed pursuit. Caleb's eyes widened. 1974. That's the year the core, the eggs, were supposedly found. And Pine Ridge Road, that's where the asylum is. He pointed to the names on Kincaid's ledger one last time. Look closely, Maya. The names are crossed out. But look at the first name on the list, the one at the very top, crossed out with the thickest, oldest line. The name was not Hickson. Faintly visible beneath the Hickson entry, crossed out and scribbled over, was a single four-letter name. Will. My father, Caleb whispered. William Vance was the first name on the collective's original hit list. Not because he was food, but because he was the key. A horrifying realization dawned on Caleb. The pattern wasn't just a feeding cycle. It was a decades-long elimination of a single bloodline. The collective had tried to get to William Vance in 1974, and when they couldn't, they moved on to eliminate the pattern disruptor, the one who could expose them. My father didn't die in an accident, Maya. He was eliminated by the collective because he knew too much, probably the true identity of the Guardian, and they knew I would eventually become a cop in Blackwood and look into his file. Caleb stood up abruptly, grabbing the evidence bag. The feds are still 2 hours out. We don't have time. If I am the last piece of the pattern, then the key must be the one. Thing my father left behind that would have explained everything to me. Where are you going? Maya asked, standing up, her hand instinctively going to her sidearm. I'm going to my childhood home, Reyes, Caleb said, his eyes now cold and determined. I'm going to find the last thing my father touched before he died. The last thing he hid, the real key that unlocks the Guardian. As they were about to leave the room, the internal police radio in the hallway crackled to life, with a priority alert, cutting through the tense silence of the station. All units, code 9 to 9. Chief Arthur Vance has failed to report for duty. Dispatch reports his home line is dead. Send immediate welfare check to 117 Maple Street. Proceed with caution. Caleb froze. The blood drained from his face. Chief Vance. Maya whispered, confusion turning instantly into dread. Caleb knew the chief's home address. He had known it since he was a kid. The chief was his father's older brother. Arthur Vance. Caleb murmured, pulling Kincaid's ledger out one last time. He flipped to the list of names, which still ended with his own Vance. My father's brother, Caleb realized, his voice hollow. The pattern isn't just about eliminating me. It was about eliminating the entire bloodline connected to William Vance. He looked at Maya, his eyes now burning with a cold fury. The pattern is moving faster than we thought. They already took the chief. They're coming for me next. But they won't find the key on my father. They'll find it on the Guardian. The realization that the chief, his own uncle, Arthur Vance, was the latest victim sent a jolt of icy adrenaline through Caleb. The pattern wasn't just old history. It was a present, active, and highly efficient threat, designed to terminate the lineage of anyone who interfered with the core in 1974. They're not waiting for nightfall, Caleb muttered, stuffing the ledger into his pocket. They've shifted the timeline. Caleb, we need to call in a tactical unit on 117 Maple Street, Maya urged, grabbing her radio. No, Caleb said, his voice flat. If the collective is still active, they'll know that address is compromised. They won't be there. They took the chief to find out what he knew about my father. They're trying to preempt the key. He turned to the wall map of Blackwood pinned in the interrogation room. He found the asylum, 448 Pine Ridge, the chief's home, 117 Maple Street, and his father's old house, where he grew up, 305 Juniper Lane. The 3 points formed a triangle. The pattern is geometric, Reyes, Caleb said, tapping the map. They move in cycles, they use symbols, and they're using specific locations. I need to get to my father's house. That's the only place he could have hidden anything from 1970 for that Arthur, the chief, wouldn't have known about. They drove to 305 Juniper Lane in silence, the squad car cutting through the damp, morning air. The house was a modest, 2-story colonial, now owned by a family who were fortunately away on vacation. Caleb had the old keys from his childhood that he entered the house. The familiar smell of mothballs and old wood hitting him instantly. He went straight to the dusty attic, the one place he knew his parents' old belongings were stored, sealed away after the accident. Maya guarded the stairwell, her rifle held ready. The attic was stifling, filled with the ghosts of Caleb's childhood. He found the old steamer trunk labeled William and Sarah Vance. Inside, under stacks of old clothes and forgotten toys, he found his father's police duty belt. The belt was exactly as it should be, minus the weapon, but tucked into a small, zippered pocket. Caleb found something unexpected, a miniature leather-bound Bible. It was thin, worn, and had been clearly used often. A Bible, Maya asked from the doorway, having climbed up to check on him. My father was a quiet man, never overtly religious, Caleb said, running his thumb over the worn cover. He opened it to the front page. Inscribed on the first page, in his father's familiar, looped handwriting, was a dedication. To my son, Caleb, remember the word and find the key in the shepherd's name. 1974. Caleb looked at Maya. His eyes narrowed. The shepherd, the operative in the lab. My father knew about her. He knew the name. He flipped to the index of the Bible, searching for the book of shepherd. It wasn't there until he realized the word meant the book itself. He flipped to the Gospel of John, one of the most famous books, and a common place to hide notes. He opened to John chapter 10, where Jesus is famously called the Good Shepherd. Tucked deep within the pages of chapter 10, between verses 11 and 12, was a brittle, folded slip of paper. It wasn't Kincaid's ledger paper. It was an official Blackwood Sanitarium admission form, dated 1968. Caleb and Maya read the form together, the truth of the last 50 years finally clicking into place. Blackwood Sanitarium admission, field details patient named Frownyface, classified/redacted, admitting physician, Dr. Elias Thorne. Reason for admission, severe dissociative personality disorder, extreme delusion regarding extra-dimensional infestation. Notes, patient exhibits unusual control over other inmates, requires constant physical restraint. Subject is the source of the whistle sonic control mechanism. Assigned guardian, Arthur Vance. Police Sergeant. Caleb's hand trembled, dropping the form. Arthur Vance, Maya breathed, her voice barely a whisper. The chief. He wasn't the victim. Caleb stared at the paper, the final, horrifying piece of the pattern clicking into place. He wasn't the victim. Reyes. He was the guardian. Caleb finished, his voice a low growl. Arthur Vance, my own uncle, was assigned as the guardian to the patient who controlled the collective. My father, William, found out about the asylum's true purpose, the children and the core. He was trying to expose the patient and his guardian in 1974. Caleb flipped the form over. Scrawled on the back, in his father's hurried, fearful script, was the final clue, the key. The core is under the sanctuary. The guardian is a protector. The patient is the control. The guardian must be destroyed by the one he loves the most. Arthur's safe is in the station's basement wall. It holds the whistle and the patient's real name. The key is the name. Caleb pushed himself to his feet, a dangerous calm settling over him. We have to go back to the station, Reyes. The chief's safe. It's not house check. It's the final piece of evidence. Suddenly, the house was plunged into darkness. The power went out with a low, dying hum. Maya immediately raised her rifle, pointing toward the unlit attic entrance. Caleb, they're here. They cut the power. Caleb heard the familiar, rhythmic sound again, muffled this time, coming from directly under the attic floorboards. Thump, thump, thump. But this time, it wasn't a decoy. It was followed by the wet, frantic scraping of claws on wood, and the distinct sound of wood splintering under immense pressure. Whatever was below was much larger than the child they had seen in the lab, and then the high, mocking giggle erupted from beneath their feet, closer than ever before, echoing with malicious glee. They brought the chief safe here, Reyes, Caleb said, his voice hard. They want the key, and they know I have the ledger. The wood directly under Caleb's boots burst open with a violent crack. A massive, pale, segmented limb, dripping with black oil, shot through the floor, clawing blindly for his legs. Caleb immediately yanked his foot back, avoiding the massive, segmented claw that ripped through the attic floorboards. The stench of that black, oily residue, the creature's ichor, filled the hot, close air. The creature beneath was digging fast, and it was much larger and stronger than the one they encountered in the lab. "Move! To the window now!" Caleb yelled, shoving Maya toward a small, grimy attic window. Maya fired 3 rapid rounds through the floor, aiming at the source of the clawing. The gunshots were muffled, the noise absorbed by the insulation and wood, but the claw retracted instantly, followed by a wet, irritated hiss. It slowed it down, but it's still under the house. Maya reported, climbing onto the sill. "It's too high, Caleb. We'll break our legs. We go through the roof then," Caleb decided, grabbing an old, rusted pickaxe leaning against a stack of boxes. "They want the key. They want the name. We lead them away from the station." He glanced down at the admission form in his hand. Arthur Vance, assigned guardian. He knew the creature, or whatever controlled it, was focused on the location of the key. Believing his father had hidden it here, he swung the pickaxe, smashing the plaster and lathe wall near the chimney, exposing the sturdy wooden roof trusses. "Use the trusses, Reyes. Go!" As Maya scrambled onto the rafters, another section of the floor burst inward. Not a claw, but the full, distended head of the creature burst through, its single, giggling mouth open and aimed at Maya's legs. The head was bulbous, pale, and seemed to be blind, relying entirely on the vibration of the structure. Caleb swung the pickaxe with desperate force, striking the creature's neck where it met the floor. A spray of black oil erupted, and the creature shrieked, a high-pitched sound of pure rage, pulling its head back down. "Go! I'll cover you!" Caleb yelled. He turned and struck the thin roofline above the window, smashing through the shingles and wood. He climbed out onto the steeply pitched roof, pulling himself onto the chimney ledge. Maya followed just behind him. They looked down. The misty morning street of Juniper Lane was deserted, but the house was collapsing inward. The massive creature below had ceased being cautious, tearing through the floor and the main joists. The roof groaned under the stress. Caleb scrambled across the shingles to the edge of the roof, looking for a clean escape. He saw an old oak tree next to the house, its branches reaching toward the second story. He was about to jump when he saw something on the street. A dark gray sedan, perfectly clean, parked half a block away, and standing next to it, watching the roof, was a man in a black tactical uniform. The IT wasn't Shepard, but another member of the collective, watching the action unfold, calm and methodical. The Guardian's enforcers. The man raised his hand and pointed not at Caleb, but at a specific spot on the roof, just behind them, the old television antenna. "Get down!" Caleb screamed, recognizing the signal. He shoved Maya off the roof, just as a powerful, high-frequency thrumming noise emanated from the dark gray sedan. The sound was focused entirely on the antenna. The antenna and the surrounding metal flashing instantly vibrated with such intensity that the metal heated to a red glow. The resulting blast of acoustic energy and electrical feedback tore a hole in the roof where they had just been standing. They fell, tumbling into the thick branches of the oak tree. The impact shattered a few small branches, but the dense foliage broke their fall. They landed hard on the wet grass, bruised and scraped, but alive. They immediately scrambled to their feet, running toward the squad car parked a block away. As they ran, Caleb looked back at his childhood home. The roof was now fully compromised. The huge, pale body of the creature was visible inside the attic, its giggling mouth wide open in furious disappointment. It realized its targets were gone. The collective agent got back into the sedan and sped silently away, clearly having failed to retrieve the ledger but succeeding in destroying the location of the supposed key. They reached the squad car, slamming the doors shut. Caleb didn't bother with the radio. He hit the accelerator, spinning the tires on the wet asphalt. "The chief's safe, Reyes," Caleb gasped, speeding toward the station. "They failed here. They'll be watching the station next. We have to beat them." He drove faster than strictly necessary, his mind racing. He pulled out the Blackwood Sanitarium admission form again, staring at the redacted patient name and the designation, Arthur Vance, assigned guardian. They thought the key was the name of the original patient, but my father said the key is the name of the guardian's control. Caleb realized he looked at the admission form one last time. He suddenly remembered a faint, almost invisible watermark visible only under a high-intensity lamp, a common feature on forms of that era. He pulled the small, high-powered LED penlight from his tactical vest and shone it directly onto the paper. The intense light made the faint watermark appear. It was the name of the printing company, Starkman and Sons Printing, Blackwood. But the light also revealed something else, faintly visible where the patient's name was redacted. A series of tiny, almost microscopic pinpricks, forming the letters of the patient's true name, punched through the paper with a needle. A message meant only for a curious hand. He ran his finger over the microscopic holes, feeling the pattern. Thomasgray. Thomas Gray. Not just the patient, but the source of the whistle's control and the leader of the collective, protected by the guardian, Arthur Vance, for decades. "We have the name Reyes," Caleb said, his voice cold with absolute certainty. "Now we find the safe. We get the whistle. We break the pattern." They skidded into the empty station parking lot, the building eerily quiet under the midday sun. They had a brief window before the collective agents arrived. Caleb glanced at the basement access door. He knew the chief's office, and thus his personal safe, was directly above the main boiler room. "Reyes, you take the perimeter. I'm going for the safe. If anyone comes in, you use extreme caution. They are operating with biological and acoustic weapons," Caleb commanded. He grabbed a crowbar from the trunk and headed toward the chief's office, knowing the final confrontation was minutes away. The chief was gone. The house was destroyed, but the key was waiting in the basement wall, and the whole city of Blackwood was now waiting for the next cycle of the pattern to begin. Part 12. The Guardian's Legacy, the conclusion. Caleb raced into the chief's office, the air thick with tension. He found the access panel to the basement utility closet, a small, nondescript door hidden behind a coat rack. He used the crowbar to pry it open and descended the creaking wooden stairs into the police station's maintenance basement. The air down here was heavy with the smell of old pipes and dust. He found the boiler room, just as his father's final note predicted. Set into the concrete wall behind the heavy, heat-hissing boiler was a small, reinforced safe. Caleb didn't bother with the combination. He slammed the crowbar against the lock mechanism, the sound reverberating loudly through the station above. On the third strike, the metal groaned and buckled. On the fourth, the lock broke clean. He ripped the door open inside. Resting on a bed of old papers was the silver whistle, the Guardian's control mechanism, and next to it, a final, folded piece of paper. Caleb snatched the paper first. It was a suicide note, signed by Chief Arthur Vance, dated this morning. "I am sorry, William. I couldn't break the contract. Thomas Gray gave me the power to control him and the collective through the whistle, and he let me raise your son. He promised me Caleb would be safe if I enforced the pattern. I sealed the asylum. I hid the name, but Thomas broke the cycle. He wants the Vance bloodline eliminated for the final ritual. I broke the agreement. I took the final names off the list, trying to save Caleb, but they took me instead. The only way to stop them is to play the whistle once, in the tunnels, and call Thomas out. It will break the psychic link and free the hosts. Tell Caleb I loved him, and I did what I had to do for him to live a normal life. Forgive me." Caleb understood the tragic inheritance. Arthur Vance had been playing the long game, enforcing the murderous pattern to protect his nephew, the last key. He had been a hero and a villain, forced by Thomas Gray, the patient, to become the guardian. He grabbed the silver whistle and sprinted back up the stairs. Maya met him in the hallway, her face white. "Caleb, they're here." Two black sedans just pulled into the lot. They're dressed in black tack gear, carrying large cases. "It's Thomas Gray's collective," Caleb confirmed, his eyes fixed on the whistle. "They know I have the key. We need to go back to the asylum." He handed her the note and the admission form. "Call the feds. Give them the name Thomas Gray. Tell them to meet us at the Pine Ridge Asylum. Tell them we're going to break the link." They drove back to the asylum, the two black sedans of the collective tailing them closely. Caleb and Maya smashed the fence lock and raced into the familiar, terrifying lobby. They descended into the lab, the stench of the creature's ichor still heavy in the air. They reached the brass drain cover, the location of the core. "They're coming down the stairs, Caleb," Maya warned, aiming her rifle at the tunnel entrance above. Caleb didn't hesitate. He took the silver whistle, placed it to his lips, and blew with all his strength at a piercing, high-frequency sound, sharper than the acoustic weapon, erupted into the tunnel system. It was a call, a command, and a break in the psychic wall Thomas Gray had built. Immediately, the heavy brass drain cover in front of Caleb began to lift, slowly, smoothly, and from the darkness below, the smooth, cold voice of Thomas Gray emerged, furious and echoing. "You fool! Arthur's pattern was mercy. You have broken the contract. Now you will replace him as the final host." From the tunnel entrance above, 2 armed agents of the collective appeared, leveling rifles. Caleb, ignoring the immediate threat, held the whistle ready. As the drain cover opened fully, revealing a blinding, swirling mass of pale, segmented bodies and the glowing, crystalline core beneath, Caleb yelled his final defiance. "Thomas Gray, I am Caleb Vance. I have the whistle. I am the new guardian. I am calling out the first host, the one who controls the collective. I am calling out the key." He pointed the whistle at the hole and blew a second time. A short, sharp blast that a flash of movement erupted from the swirling mass of the children. A pale, middle-aged man, dressed in a standard hospital gown, shot up from the depths of the core. Directly into the LABIT was Thomas Gray, the patient, fully exposed. The collective agents above, hearing the second whistle blast, immediately dropped their rifles, clutching their heads in agony. The psychic link was broken. Thomas Gray stared at Caleb, his eyes clear and rational for the first time, not the madness of P001. He looked down at his own hands, then at the hole. He was finally free from the madness of the children. "It's over," Thomas Gray whispered, his voice weak. "The core, it controls them now, not me." As the Fed sirens finally wailed in the distance, Thomas Gray turned, looked straight down into the swirling hole of the core, and with a look of terrible clarity and resolve, he threw himself back into the abyss, taking the patient with the whistle's control down with him. The brass drain cover slammed shut with a final, deafening clang. The sound of the Fed's choppers reached the asylum, signaling the end of the pattern, but the beginning of Blackwood's real horror. Would you like me to write a short epilogue to wrap up the aftermath? Caleb, ignoring the ringing in his ears from the whistle, watched the heavy brass drain cover seal itself, completely, with the final, echoing clang. The sudden, absolute silence in the lab was profound, broken only by the sound of sirens rapidly approaching the derelict sanitarium. He turned, the silver whistle still hot in his hand. The 2 black collective agents, who had been advancing with rifles, were now curled up on the cold floor of the access tunnel, clutching their heads, their tactical gear now useless. The psychic link was shattered, leaving them just shell-shocked men. Maya, pale and shaken, lowered her rifle. "It's over," she whispered, looking at the spot where Thomas Gray, the real patient, the true controller, had vanished. He chose to break the link. "He didn't choose," Caleb said, his voice flat, looking at the whistle. "I forced him to break it. The whistle isn't a control, it's a psychic conductor. The first blast called him out. The second blast redirected the allegiance of the collective from him to the one holding the whistle, the guardian. He knew if he stayed, I would have used the whistle to command him to shut the core down forever. He chose to go back and seal himself and the children in, rather than be controlled." The first team of federal agents, dressed in unmarked heavy gear and carrying non-standard weapons, burst into the lab. They didn't look like FBI. They looked like scientists and soldiers. Their leader, a sharp-faced woman with cold eyes, identified herself simply as Agent Hollis, DI, Division of Internal Anomalies. She took one look at the oily residue on the floor, the sealed drain, and the unconscious collective agents, and nodded grimly. "You did well, Officer Vance. You secured the breach and neutralized the pattern's host," Agent Hollis said, her voice devoid of emotion. She quickly had her team bag the unconscious agents and the silvery whistle. Caleb handed her the ledger and the admission form. The host's name was Thomas Gray. He was protected by Chief Arthur Vance, my uncle. The asylum was a breeding ground for these creatures, the children, fueled by fear and controlled by Gray's psychic influence through that whistle. The pattern was a systematic elimination of anyone who knew the truth, starting with my father in 1974. Hollis accepted the documents without a word. Your father, William Vance, was on our radar. He was one of the few Blackwood PD officers who didn't take the payout to look the other way. He contacted us, but we were too late. My father called you. Caleb asked, surprised. He called the DIA. Hollis confirmed, tapping Kincaid's ledger. Kincaid, the original detective, was the one who was taking the payoff. He was forced by Thomas Gray to frame William's death as an accident and cover up the mass suicide. Your father died trying to mail us the original admission form. Caleb finally understood the depth of the betrayal and the decades of sacrifice. His father wasn't running away. He was fighting a hidden war. Over the next few hours, the asylum was completely secured by the DIA. The site was redesignated as a high-containment biological exclusion zone. All evidence, including the massive pile of old uniforms, was removed or incinerated. Maya and Caleb were debriefed extensively. They were forced to sign numerous non-disclosure agreements, effectively erasing the official record of everything they saw. The children, the core, the shepherd, and the whistle. The official Blackwood PD report would list the event as a massive, drug-related gang conflict that led to a structural fire, requiring federal intervention. Chief Arthur Vance would be listed as a casualty in the initial confrontation. Days later, back in his small, untouched apartment, Caleb stared at a framed photograph of his father. He was no longer just a ghost of a dead cop. He was a silent hero. There was a quiet knock on his door. It was Agent Hollis. She didn't enter. She simply handed him a small, sealed box. A final piece of evidence, Officer Vance. We recovered it from the chief's home. It was locked in a safe deposit box. Hollis gave him a cold, appraising look. The whistle is destroyed. Thomas Gray is sealed, and the collective is contained. The pattern is broken, but the truth, you're now one of the only people who knows the truth of Blackwood. We'll be watching. She left without another word. Caleb opened the box. It wasn't the whistle. It was a single, small, hand-carved wooden toy, a police officer. This one was old, dusty, and painted the faded colors of a 1970